Part 1. The silence was the enemy, the great and final predator that had devoured every human voice but his. Kalen existed in the quiet hollow of the cosmos, a ghost haunting a machine built to be a tomb and a library in equal measure. His ship, the Minimausin, was a sliver of dark metal and colder light, designed not for war, but for witness. It slid through the forgotten alleys of the galaxy, a needle stitching a thread of memory through a tapestry of void where civilization once burned bright. He was the last remembrancer, a title that felt less like an honor and more like a diagnosis for a terminal condition. Inside his skull, humanity lived on, a riotous, beautiful, and deafeningly loud tenant in a house of one. He could close his eyes and walk the bustling streets of a pre-fall Tokyo, the scent of ramen and rain-slicked asphalt so real he'd choke on it. He could feel the sun on his face in the vineyards of Tuscany, hear the laughter of children he'd never met, taste wine from grapes that had turned to cosmic dust 80 years ago. He held every note of Beethoven's Ninth, every brushstroke of a Van Gogh, every line of Shakespeare, and every whispered "I love you" from a billion forgotten deathbeds. This was his sacred duty and his unending torture. The architects of the Lazarus Ark project had wanted to save the soul of their species, so they had poured it all into him. A living codex. A boy whose genes were twisted to hold the weight of a world. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams and failed in the only way that mattered. They saved the story, but lost everyone who could listen to it. He had escaped the fall, a lone spark fleeing a galactic firestorm, while Earth and its colonies were not conquered, not defeated, but erased. The enemy had a name whispered only in the dead spaces between stars, a name Kalen had gleaned from the fractured data logs of other, less fortunate species who had crossed their path, the Silenti. They were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were archivists of oblivion. They did not crave territory or resources, but culture, information, the very essence of a species' identity. They were a cognitive plague, consuming the art, history, and language of a civilization until nothing remained but sterile ruins and biological husks. Their minds wiped clean, left to wander their silent worlds like animals until they inevitably perished. The Silenti didn't leave bodies. They left absences. They unwrote reality. And Kalen, holding the single greatest repository of uneaten data in the known universe, was their ultimate prize. His existence was a quiet ritual of maintenance and memory. He would spend cycles tending to the Mnemosyns' nutrient recyclers and fusion core, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a monk, his mind a universe away. He'd walk through the Battle of Hastings, feeling the mud squelch under his boots, then shift to the cool, logical hum of a CERN laboratory as the Higgs boson was discovered. He spoke to the ship's simple AI, a system he called Echo, not because it was sentient, but because it was the only thing that would speak back. Its voice, a calm, synthesized contralto, was the anchor that kept him from drowning in the ocean of minds within his own. Echo, run a deep space resonance scan. Focus on the C-band spectrum. I want to know if anything out here has ever sung a song. The reply was always the same. A gentle rejection. Scanning. No coherent, complex audio patterns detected. Kalen, the system is quiet. He'd nod, a bitter tightness in his chest. Of course it was quiet. The Silenti were thorough. He was currently navigating the skeletal remains of the Signian Confederacy, a system that, according to the memories he held from a pre-fall human survey team, had once been a vibrant hub of avian-like philosophers who carved their histories into crystalline mountains. Now, the planets were still there, the mountains still stood, but they were blank, smooth. Every carving, every history, every mark of their existence had been scoured away, not by energy weapons or kinetic bombardment, but by a force that simply unwound their meaning, leaving behind nothing but the raw material of what once was. It was in this graveyard of a system that his quiet life ended. He was scavenging, a dangerous but necessary task. The Mnemosyne was a marvel of preservation, but it still needed raw isotopes for its fusion pile, trace elements for its life support. He was guiding a drone through the debris field of a shattered Cygnian moon when he saw it. It was small, a shard of obsidian blackness that seemed to drink the light around it, tumbling end over end. It wasn't rock. It was technology, sleek and seamless, and as his drone sensors swept over it, a chill that had nothing to do with the vacuum of space crawled up his spine. It was a listener, a Salenti probe. It wasn't broadcasting. It wasn't armed. It was just listening, waiting for a story to tell itself. Before he could react, a spike of energy, tight-beamed and faster than thought, lanced from the probe and washed over the Mnemosyne. It wasn't an attack. It was a query, a question asked in a language of pure data, and Kalen's very existence was the answer. His mind, brimming with the cacophony of human achievement and sorrow, was like a supernova of information in the dead silence. The probe didn't need to send a signal. Its sudden, ecstatic discovery was the signal. Echo, retract the drone. All of them plot a jump course. Anywhere. Now. Kalen's voice was sharp, cutting through the calm of the bridge. Course plotted to the nearest stellar nursery. High interference. It is the best option for masking our trail. But it was too late. Reality buckled. The stars outside the viewport warped and smeared as a tear in space dilated, a wound of non-color opening in the black. From it emerged a Salenti vessel, an eraser. It was a monstrous thing, shaped like a cathedral spire made of liquid shadow, its surface shimmering with energies that made his eyes water. It had no visible weapons, no engines, no windows. It was a tool, a purpose-built instrument of forgetting. The Mnemosyne was a courier ship, a fast and nimble vessel built to run, not to fight. Kalen slammed his hands on the console, the ship lurching as its engines fired at full power. Get us into the moon's wreckage. I need cover. He wasn't a pilot. He was a librarian. But in his head were the memories of every ace pilot Earth had ever produced, from the dog fighters of the First World War to the star jockeys of the colonial fleet. He felt their instincts rise within him, a fusion of 1,000 lifetimes of experience. He pushed the ship into a spiraling dive, weaving through the jagged chunks of rock and ice that formed the debris field. The eraser followed, its movements unnervingly fluid, less like a ship and more like a predator stalking through tall grass. It didn't fire lasers or missiles. Instead, shimmering waves of force rippled from its hull, and where they passed, the wreckage they touched seemed to lose its integrity. A massive piece of nickel iron didn't explode, it just simplified. Its complex crystalline structure unraveled, its history of formation erased, until it dissolved into a cloud of monatomic dust. This was how they fought. They didn't destroy you. They undid you. Kalen's mind raced, sifting through terabytes of stored knowledge. He needed an advantage, a trick, something they wouldn't expect from a simple fleeing data cache. He found it in the memories of a forgotten astrophysicist from the 22nd century, a woman who had posited a controversial theory on localized gravity, sinks created by rapidly decaying exotic matter. The shattered moon was rich in such matter. It was a long shot, a theory that had never been proven. Echo. Scan the debris field for decaying quark-gluon plasma signatures. I need a pocket of high gravitational distortion. Scanning. Kalen. That theory was widely discredited. Just find it, he roared, his knuckles white as he dodged another wave of entropic energy that turned a mountain-sized chunk of ice into a diffuse cloud of hydrogen and oxygen. Signature detected. 0.76 astronomical units ahead. The distortion is unstable. Navigating it carries a 94% chance of catastrophic hull failure. It's better than a 100% chance of being forgotten. He steered the Namazan directly towards the coordinates, the massive Silenti ship gaining on them, its dark form blotting out the stars. He could feel its presence now, not just as a ship, but as a pressure against his mind, a terrible, hungry silence that wanted in. It wanted to quiet the symphony in his head, to smooth the wrinkles of history into a flat, featureless plane. The ship began to shudder as it entered the distortion field. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the bridge. Hull integrity at 80%, 70%. The gravimetric shear is tearing us apart. Kalen. He ignored the warnings, his eyes fixed on the navigation screen, his hands steady on the controls. He remembered the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, feeling the fragile aircraft shudder around them, a thing of wood and faith. He channeled their calm, their focus. The theory suggested that at the heart of the distortion was a null point, a tiny island of stable space-time. If he could hit it, just for a moment, the immense gravitational forces of the collapsing field would be projected outwards in a violent, chaotic wave. He saw it, a flicker on the screen, and wrenched the controls. For a single, terrifying second, the Namazan was held in a pocket of perfect stillness as the universe screamed and tore itself apart around it. Then the pocket collapsed. A wave of pure gravitational chaos erupted from their position. Not an explosion, but a tsunami of warped space-time. It slammed into the pursuing Silenti ship. The Eraser, built to manipulate reality with precision, was not prepared for such a brute force, unpredictable assault. Its shimmering entropic fields flickered and died. The liquid shadow of its hull writhed, distorted, stretched like taffy as gravity pulled it in 1,000 directions at once. It didn't break apart. It was unwound, its sophisticated form collapsing into a more primitive state, a mess of contorted alloys and leaking energy before it was crushed into a singularity of its own making. The backlash threw the Namazan clear, tumbling through space, its hull groaning, its systems screaming for mercy. Kalen fought for control, finally stabilizing the ship, its engines sputtering. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a hunter that had missed its mark and now knew, with absolute certainty, what its prey was capable of. He had survived. He had used the knowledge of his people as a weapon, but the cost was immense. They knew he existed. They knew what he carried. They would never stop. He stood on the bridge of his wounded ship, staring out at the uncaring stars, the weight of every human life, every dream, every song pressing down on him. He wasn't just a librarian anymore. He was a weapon, and in a galaxy determined to forget, his memory was the most dangerous weapon of all. Part 2. The adrenaline of survival was a treacherous drug. It's come down, leaving a residue of bone-deep exhaustion and razor-sharp clarity. As the last echoes of the gravity wave dissipated, the Mnemosyne was a wounded animal drifting in a sea of its own making. Red alerts pulsed across the bridge in a silent, rhythmic panic, each one a testament to a system pushed beyond its breaking point. The silence that flooded back in was heavier now, freighted with a new and terrible knowledge. It wasn't the passive silence of an empty universe. It was the listening silence of a patient predator. Kalen felt a tremor in his hands. The ghost of 1,000 pilots who had survived a dogfight and forced them still. He ran a diagnostic, his fingers flying across the console, the muscle memory of forgotten engineers guiding his touch. The ship's report was a litany of pain. The primary fusion core was unstable, leaking hard radiation into the aft compartments. The hull was a patchwork of microfractures, one good shock away from catastrophic depressurization. The jump drive was fried, its delicate quantum matrix scrambled by the gravimetric backlash. They were stranded, bleeding, and exposed. "Echo," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Damage assessment." The AI's voice was, as always, a pool of calm in his storm. "Structural integrity is compromised by 27%. The jump drive requires a complete diagnostic and recalibration, a process that cannot be safely performed while the fusion core is unstable. We are, functionally, a sitting duck, Kalen." He leaned back in his command chair, the synthetic leather cool against his neck, and closed his eyes. The minds within him were a storm of their own. The astrophysicist whose theory he'd weaponized was a whirlwind of horrified elation. She had been right. But the application was a monstrous perversion of her life's work. The military strategists were calculating, processing the Silentes' tactics, their vulnerabilities, their terrifying efficiency, and behind them all, the poets and the painters and the parents wept for the beauty that had been turned into a bomb. He had used a dream of understanding the universe to shatter one of its nightmares, and the act felt like a violation of his very soul. He was a library, not a sword, but the sword had been drawn, and the enemy now knew its edge. He had to move. He had to hide. He dove deep into his archives, not into military databases, but into the fringes of human knowledge, the logs of rogue prospectors, the charts of long-haul freighters, the whispered rumors from forgotten spacer bars. He needed a place the Silenti wouldn't think to look, a place so chaotic and noisy that their sterile, information-hungry sensors would be blinded. He found it in the memories of a scavenger captain, a grizzled old woman who had died of liver failure on a remote outpost. Her last thoughts, a bitter inventory of missed opportunities and one legendary score. She called it the Cacophony. It was a trinary star system with a fatal flaw. The 3 stars were locked in a gravitational dance so complex and violent that their combined magnetospheres created a nebula of perpetual electromagnetic storms. It was a ship killer, a place where nav computers went insane and sensors were useless. Over millennia, it had become a graveyard, littered with the wrecks of countless vessels from 100 species that had strayed too close. It was a place of noise, of static, of ghosts. It was perfect. Echo. Can you get the impulse engines online? With minimal power, yes, but our speed will be a fraction of our capability. And without the jump drive, we crawl. Kalen finished. Plot a course for the system designated TY381, the Cacophony. Use every asteroid field, every gas cloud, every shadow we can find for cover. The journey was a slow, agonizing crawl through the dark. For weeks, Kalen lived on nutrient paste and recycled water. His life a cycle of frantic repairs and paranoid sensor sweeps. He became an engineer, coaxing the damaged fusion core back from the brink. His mind filled with the blueprints of reactors that hadn't existed for a century. He rerouted power conduits, patched plasma leaks with cold weld foam, and wrote new stabilization algorithms for the sputtering impulse engines. The Namazan was a part of him, an extension of his body, and he could feel its every ache and groan. It was during the third week of this agonizing pilgrimage that the Silenti came again. There was no tear in space, no monstrous ship of shadow. The attack was silent, personal, and infinitely more terrifying. It started as a subtle emptiness. He was humming a piece by Debussy, Claire de Lune, letting the soft piano notes fill the quiet of the bridge. When he faltered, he couldn't remember the next chord. The memory, a perfect, crystal clear recording from a 21st century concert hall, was simply gone. A blank space existed where the music should have been. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear of any physical weapon, washed over him. He frantically tried to access another memory, the Gettysburg Address, a cornerstone of human oratory. He could see Lincoln on the podium, feel the chill in the air, but the words were muffled, indistinct, like a radio station fading into static. "Echo," he yelled, his voice cracking. "What's happening? My sensors detect nothing." "Kalen, all systems are normal. It's not the ship. It's me. They're in my head." They had analyzed the data from their destroyed probe. They had a signature, a trace of his consciousness, and now they were reaching for him across the void. They weren't just erasing reality, they were trying to erase the memory of it. He fought back, marshaling his will, trying to build firewalls of thought. He focused on the most robust, structured memories. He had mathematical proofs, the periodic table, the immutable laws of physics. But the Silenti's influence was like a solvent, not a hammer. It didn't break the memories. It dissolved their meaning, unspooling the connections that made them coherent. He felt the concept of calculus begin to fray, the elegant dance of numbers becoming a meaningless scrawl. This was their true weapon. If they couldn't have the library, they would burn the books from the inside out. He was losing. The silence was creeping into the symphony of his soul, silencing the voices one by one. In desperation, he abandoned structure and logic. He dove away from science and history and sought refuge in the messiest, most chaotic corners of the human experience. He threw the raw, unadulterated chaos of a million minds at the encroaching void. He remembered the feeling of a first kiss, awkward and electric, a messy collision of hope and fear that defied all logic. He conjured the rage of a mother defending her child, a primal, biological fury that had no equation. He unleashed the sound of a mosh pit at a punk rock show from 1982, a glorious, sweaty, violent explosion of noise and rebellion. He channeled the incoherent, heartbreaking babble of a dying soldier's last words to a lover who would never hear them. He flooded his own consciousness with the irrational, contradictory, glorious noise of being human. The silence faltered. It was an entity of pure, cold logic, a system designed to catalog and erase ordered information. This was just noise. It couldn't process the illogical surge of emotion. It couldn't file away the paradox of love and hate, of creation and destruction, of hope in the face of absolute despair. The mental pressure receded, not gone, but held at bay by the sheer, stubborn, beautiful messiness of his inherited humanity. He collapsed over the console, sweat-soaked and trembling, the ghost smell of cheap beer and old leather from the punk club still in his nostrils. Kalen. Echo's voice cut through his haze. We have arrived, entering the outer nebula of TY-381. He lifted his head and saw it. The cacophony. It was a breathtaking chaos of light and shadow. The three sons, a violent blue giant, a stable yellow dwarf, and a pulsing red dwarf chased each other across the sky, casting the swirling clouds of gas and dust in a perpetual, shifting twilight of purple, orange, and crimson. And within the nebula, like fish trapped in a net, were the ships. Thousands of them. Long, elegant cruisers of a species that had clearly valued aesthetics, their hulls now pierced and broken, brutal, angular warships of another, their weapon ports silent and dark, small, insect-like freighters tangled in the skeletal remains of vast space stations. It was a graveyard that stretched for light years, and the electromagnetic radiation washing over the Mnemosyne was a deafening roar of static. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He guided the ship deep into the maze of wrecks, finding a hollowed-out asteroid that had once been the command center of a forgotten fleet. He powered down all non-essential systems, letting the ship go cold and dark. Just another piece of dead metal in a field of ghosts. He was safe, for now. The external static of the nebula would mask his ship, and the internal static of human emotion would shield his mind. But he knew, as he sat there in the borrowed silence of the dead, that this was only a reprieve. He could no longer be a passive vessel. Hiding wasn't a strategy, it was a delay of the inevitable. The Salenti had forced his hand. He had defended himself with the memories of the dead, but defense was not enough. He had to learn to attack. He had to take the symphony of humanity, all its beauty and all its rage, and teach it how to scream. He looked out at the silent, twisted forms of the dead ships, a library of failures. And, for the first time, he didn't see an ending. He saw an arsenal. Part 3. The cacophony was a tomb, but for Kalen, it became a workshop. The initial safety afforded by the nebula's electromagnetic chaos was a bandage on a mortal wound, a temporary solution to an existential threat. Hiding was a slow death. He had to reforge his purpose, to transform his role from archivist to architect, from a vessel of memory into a wielder of it. The graveyard of ships surrounding the Mnemosyne was no longer a symbol of galactic failure. It was a dormant army waiting for a general. His plan was audacious, born from the combined knowledge of 1,000 mad engineers and desperate tacticians slumbering in his mind. He would not just pilot one ship. He would awaken them all. He would conduct an orchestra of ghosts. His first target was a Cathar Marauder, a vessel shaped like the fossilized skull of a raptor, all sharp angles and predatory grace. The Cathar had been a species of brutalist poets, and their ships reflected it, overpowered, inefficient, and terrifyingly beautiful. He sent out his drones, spider-like machines that skittered across the Marauder's pitted hull, their plasma cutters slicing through a breached airlock. Inside, the ship was a mausoleum of cold metal and zero-gravity frost. The drones navigated to the engineering deck, to the ship's central processing core, a crystalline matrix that pulsed with a faint, residual energy. Accessing it was the true challenge. Cathar machine language was a nightmare of recursive logic and non-linear syntax. But Kalen had an advantage. He held the memories of Dr. Eris Thorne, a xenolinguist who had dedicated his life to deciphering Cathar code before the fall. Kalen didn't just read Thorne's research. He became Thorne, feeling the man's obsessive passion, his frustration, his final triumphant breakthrough. He interfaced through the drone, his mind translating human intent into the alien ship's native tongue. He didn't hack the system, he spoke to it. He whispered to the dormant reactor, coaxing it with the correct power-up sequences. He soothed the confused diagnostic sensors. He commanded the life support to activate in the engineering section, not with a burst of power, but with a gentle, steady flow. For 3 days, he worked, a silent god tending to a dead titan. Then, it happened. A single light flickered on the Marauder's bridge, a pinprick of defiant green in the vast, suffocating dark. It was followed by a low hum, the sound of a fusion reactor stirring from a long sleep. Kalen watched on his monitor, a wave of profound, aching triumph washing over him. He hadn't just salvaged a machine, he had resurrected a sliver of a forgotten history. The ship was a phantom limb, an extension of the Minimosini, connected by a fragile thread of data. He could feel its systems, its power reserves, its silent, waiting weapons. The activation of the Cathar ship, however small, was a stone tossed into a stagnant pond. The ripple it created did not go unnoticed. 2 days later, while he was attempting to interface with a second vessel, a hulking, Vorn cargo hauler, Echo's voice cut through his concentration. Kalen, I am detecting an approaching vessel. Small, high-energy signature. It is not Silenti. Kalen's blood ran cold. He immediately shut down the power flow to the Cathar ship and cloaked the Mnemosyne in the asteroid shadow. He watched the approaching ship on his passive sensors. It was a scavenger vessel, a Frankenstein's monster of welded hulls and mismatched engines, ugly, practical, and alive. It moved with a confident familiarity through the treacherous debris fields. Its pilot clearly an old hand in this graveyard. It stopped near the Cathar Marauder, its running lights bathing the dead ship in a searching glare. A voice crackled over a wide band, unencrypted channel, raw and laced with static. All right, you ghost. Saw your little light show. Come out and say hello before I start knocking. Kalen remained silent, his heart pounding. He hadn't spoken to another living being in years. The voice was female, laced with a cynical, weary authority. After a minute of silence, the voice came again. Fine. Have it your way. A cutting laser, thin and intensely bright, erupted from the scavenger ship, beginning to slice into the Marauder's hull. She was trying to carve her way into whatever prize had turned the lights on. He had a choice: stay silent and let her potentially damage his new asset, or reveal himself. The memories of 1,000 diplomats and psychologists screamed that isolation was a death sentence. He needed allies. He needed another perspective. He opened a channel. That won't be necessary, he said, his own voice sounding alien and unused in his ears. The cutting laser immediately ceased. There was a long pause. "Well, well," the voice replied, the cynicism sharpening into suspicion. "A ghost that talks. You've got 5 seconds to tell me who you are and what you're doing powering up Cathar Iron before I assume you're a trap and turn this whole sector into slag." "My name is Kalen. I am a survivor. Lots of survivors out here, pal. Most of them are trying to kill me. Be more specific," he explained, slowly, haltingly, leaving out the most unbelievable parts about the library of minds within him. He told her he had a unique interface system that allowed him to reactivate dormant ships. Her laughter was harsh and humorless. "An interface system. Right. Kid, I've been stripping these wrecks since before you were born. The only way to power one of these things is with a new core and a team of engineers. So, try again." Instead of arguing, he showed her. He focused, reached out with his mind through the Namazan systems, and commanded the Cathar Marauder to activate its external floodlights. The powerful beams flared to life, illuminating the scavenger's ship in a brilliant, shocking glare. The open channel was filled with a sharp, indrawn breath, followed by a string of curses. How did you do that?" "I told you, I have a unique way of communicating." A few minutes later, she docked with his asteroid hideout, her ship locking onto an external port with a heavy clang. She came aboard alone, a tall woman in a patched pressure suit, her helmet held under one arm. Her face was sharp, etched with lines of hardship and resolve, her gray eyes missing nothing. She held a plasma rifle with the casual ease of a carpenter holding a hammer. "My name's Lyra," she said, her voice less harsh without the radio's distortion. "And you have a lot of explaining to do. Kalen the Ghost." Over the next cycle, he told her everything: the fall, the Silenti, the Namazan, the Lazarus Ark project. He watched her face for signs of disbelief, of mockery, but she just listened, her expression unreadable. When he was done, she was silent for a long time, staring out at the graveyard of ships. "A walking library of dead people," she finally said, her voice flat. "And you woke up a ship with your brain." She shook her head, not in disbelief, but in a kind of weary wonder. "I thought I'd seen everything this broken galaxy had to offer." She looked at him then, her gaze sharp and calculating. "So, what's the plan? You gonna build yourself a little kingdom out here in the scrap?" "I'm going to build an army," Kalen replied, his voice steady. "And I'm going to hunt the things that did this to us." Lyra stared at him, and, for the first time, a flicker of something other than cynicism crossed her face. It might have been respect. "Hunt the Silenti," she mused. "That's not a plan. That's a suicide note." "Hiding is a slower suicide," he countered. "You know this graveyard better than anyone. I have the means to awaken these ships, but I don't know which ones are worth the effort. You do. Help me." It was the beginning of an unlikely partnership. Lyra, the pragmatist, became his hands and eyes in the graveyard. She knew which wrecks held intact reactors, which ones had military-grade sensors, which ones were death traps of radiation and failing systems. She would guide him to a prize, an elegant Xylan cruiser with its powerful sensor suite, mostly intact. A brutish Vorn battleship with a triple reinforced hull, and he would perform his strange, silent magic. They worked out of the asteroid's command center, turning the dead outpost into the nerve center of their growing phantom fleet. He wired the Nemasan systems directly into the asteroid's broadcast array, amplifying his reach. One by one, more lights began to dot the darkness of the cacophony. A network of ghost ships, all slave to his will, formed a silent constellation around their hidden base. He now commanded a fleet of 27 ships from a dozen different species, a menagerie of dead technologies brought back to a semblance of life. But they were still hiding. It was time to set the trap. The Silenti are drawn to complex, ordered information, Kalen explained to Lyra, standing before a holographic display of his new fleet. That's what I am. That's what they hunt. We can't fight them on their terms, so we have to make them come to ours. You want to draw them here? Lyra asked, her arms crossed. You're ringing the dinner bell, Kyle. I'm setting the table, he corrected. I'm going to create a signal, a broadcast so dense with the patterns of life and intelligence that they won't be able to resist it. A symphony of knowledge, broadcasted from the heart of this storm. They'll come expecting a single, frightened voice. Instead, they'll find an entire chorus, and every single one of us will be armed to the teeth. He began to compose his message, his trap. It was the most human thing he could imagine. He wove together the mathematical proof of the Riemann hypothesis, the double helix structure of human DNA, the soaring architecture of Bach's Chaconne in D minor, and the final, rain-soaked monologue of Roy Batty from an ancient film about artificial men who dreamed of life. It was a beacon of art, science, and philosophy. It was the soul of his species, sharpened to a razor's edge. He linked the broadcast to every ship in his ghost fleet, preparing to amplify the signal 1,000-fold. It was the ultimate lure, a song so beautiful it would call the monsters from the deep. Lyra watched him, her hand resting on the grip of her plasma rifle. You're really going to do it. Kalen looked at the holographic ships, his silent, loyal ghosts. Each one was a testament to a species that had been silenced. He was about to make them sing again, a final or defiant roar against the quiet. He took a breath, the weight of 1 billion dead souls on his shoulders, and gave the command, sing. Part 4. The command to sing was not a keystroke, it was an act of will. Kalen opened the floodgates of his mind, and the soul of humanity poured out into the void. The broadcast was not sound or light, but a modulated wave of pure meaning. A signal so dense with complexity that it warped the very fabric of the nebula's static. It was the defiant shout of a species that refused to be forgotten, amplified 1,000-fold by the combined broadcast arrays of 27 dead ships. The cacophony, once a haven of random noise, was now home to a structured, beautiful, and profoundly dangerous symphony. For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The chaotic dance of the trinary suns, the endless hiss of electromagnetic interference, it all seemed to fade into the background, a mere accompaniment to the grand composition Kalen had unleashed. Lyra stood beside him on the bridge of the Nemazini, her arms crossed, watching the energy readings spike into the red. You're not exactly being subtle. Kyle, she muttered, though her voice held a note of grudging awe. Subtlety is a luxury of the safe, he replied. His eyes closed, his consciousness spread thin across his phantom fleet. He could feel each ship as a distinct presence, a unique instrument in his orchestra. The raw, percussive power of the Cathar Marauder, the high, clear sensor notes of the Xylan cruiser, the deep, resonant bass of the Vorn battleship. They hunt order. I've given them the most ordered, complex pattern this side of a galactic core. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched into hours. Kalen kept the symphony playing, a continuous loop of human genius and folly. He and Lyra fell into a tense, quiet rhythm. She ran continuous diagnostics on the Ghost fleet, ensuring their fragile, resurrected systems could handle the strain. He, in turn, focused on maintaining the broadcast, a lighthouse keeper tending a beam meant to attract a kraken. "You ever think?" Lyra said, breaking a long silence, her gaze fixed on a holographic display of a dead Vorn battleship, about what they were like, the Vorn, the Cathar, all of them, before they were just scrap for me to pick over. The question resonated deep within Kalen. He didn't have to think. He knew. He could access the memories of the human survey teams who had made first contact. The Vorn were merchants, he said softly, obsessed with balance sheets and trade law. They saw the universe as a grand equation to be solved for profit. They would have hated this. The inefficiency, the waste. He gestured to another ship. The Cathar believed that true beauty could only be forged in conflict. Their poetry was written in the language of ballistics and engine thrust. They would have loved this. Lyra was quiet for a moment. "And us humans, what do you think they'd say about what you're doing, using our art, our history, as bait?" The question was a physical blow. He felt the weight of the billion souls within him, a silent jury. "I think," he said, the words heavy in his mouth, "they would be horrified. And I think they would understand. We're using the memory of our soul to save the possibility of having one again." It was then that the change came. It was not a ship dropping from a tear in space. It was a subtraction, the chaotic, roaring static of the cacophony. The very noise that had been their shield began to die. It was as if someone had placed a giant, silencing hand over the nebula. The energy readings on their console began to smooth out, the jagged peaks of interference flattening into an eerie, unnatural calm. The symphony Kalen was broadcasting began to sound thin and exposed in the sudden quiet. "They're here," Lyra breathed, her hand instinctively going to the plasma rifle slung over her chair. "They're not just here," Kalen whispered, a new, terrifying pressure building against his mind. "They're listening." 3 wounds of non-color opened in the unnatural silence. From them emerged not 1, but 3 silenti erasers, their liquid shadow hulls drinking the light of the 3 suns. They were larger than the one he had destroyed, their forms more defined, less like spires and more like obsidian blades honed to a perfect edge. They didn't move toward the signal source. They spread out, forming a perfect equilateral triangle around the densest part of the wreck field, the area where Kalen's ghost fleet lay in ambush. They were preparing not an attack, but a dissection. "They learned from our last encounter," Kalen said, his voice tight. "They're not just rushing in." He took a steadying breath. The memories of 1,000 chess grandmasters calculating odds and probabilities. Fine, let's give them a new lesson. With a flick of his will, he sent a squadron of 5 ships forward, 3 agile Cathar marauders and 2 sturdy Vorn haulers. They were his pawns, expendable and positioned to test the enemy's response. They powered up their weapons, A crude but potent mix of plasma cannons and kinetic drivers salvaged and brought online by Lyra's expertise and his mental commands. The lead eraser responded. It didn't fire a weapon. A wave of force, a ripple in the fabric of space itself, pulsed from its hull. It was different from the entropic wave he'd seen before. This was more focused. The wave washed over the lead Cathar Marauder, and the ship simply ceased to be a ship. Its complex systems, its weapon arrays, its armored hull, they were all de-resolved. The information that constituted warship was erased, and the matter that had formed it collapsed back into its constituent elements. A sudden, silent cloud of incandescent gas and shimmering dust. It's a deconstruction field, Kalen analyzed, the mind of a weapons designer dissecting the attack. Targeted, precise, it unwrites technology. He didn't hesitate. All remaining ships, fire at will, brute force, overwhelm one of them. His remaining 22 ships roared to life. Plasma bolts, railgun slugs, and crude, powerful missiles tore through the vacuum. A storm of physical violence aimed at the nearest eraser. The Silenti ship's shimmering entropic shields flared as the projectiles impacted, but they held. It was like throwing rocks at a god. Then the Silenti changed their tactics. They had realized the ships were being controlled remotely. They weren't hunting ships. They were hunting the controller. The mental pressure on Kalen intensified 100-fold. It wasn't the subtle, dissolving touch from before. This was a direct, surgical strike. He felt it as a series of sharp, cutting sensations in his mind. They were severing his connections to the Ghost Fleet. The Xylan cruiser on his holographic display flickered and went dark. He could no longer feel its presence, no longer access its systems. It was adrift, a ghost once more, then another, a Vorn battleship. They weren't destroying the ships. They were isolating him, pruning the branches of his network, leaving the trunk exposed. The voices in his head cried out as their collective consciousness was fractured. He was the librarian, and they were burning his card catalog, leaving him lost in the stacks. He fought to maintain control, his thoughts a desperate battleground. He felt the connection to the Cathar Marauder closest to him begin to fray, the link stretching thin and threatening to snap. "Kyle! They're cutting you off," Lyra yelled, her eyes darting between the tactical display and Kalen's pale, sweat-sheened face. "You're losing them." He gritted his teeth, the strain immense. "I know I can't. I can't hold them all." He was a juggler whose hands were being tied, one finger at a time. The symphony faltered. The complex signal fracturing into discordant notes as his control slipped. The Silenti pressed their advantage. The three erasers began to slowly, inexorably, close in on the asteroid, their target now clear. They knew where he was. They were coming to silence the singer himself. "There's too many of them, and their defenses are too strong for our junk pile weapons," Lyra said, her voice grim but steady as she analyzed the energy readings. "We can't win a straight fight. We have to change the board." She pointed at the trinary suns on the display. The blue giant, it's old, unstable, prone to massive coronal mass ejections. That's what causes most of the storms in this nebula. Kalen, struggling to keep his remaining dozen ships online, could barely process her words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we make our own storm," she shot back, her eyes alight with a desperate, feral cunning. "The Marauders still have their main cannons." "Right, the big ones, the planet crackers." He managed a nod. his focus splintering. Get the three you still have control of close to the sun, as close as their shields will allow. At my mark, I want you to have all three of them fire their main cannons directly into the star's photosphere, at the same time, at the same spot. The memories of the astrophysicist in his head screamed in protest. That's insane. The feedback would vaporize the ships, and the resulting solar flare would sterilize this entire sector. Exactly, Lyra's voice was a blade in the chaos. They're expecting a chess match from a librarian. Let's give them a bar fight from a scavenger. They've silenced our storm, so we'll make a new one out of fire and fury. It's our only chance. Kyle, but you have to give the order. Now. Kaelin looked at the three erasers closing in, their silent, patient menace a promise of absolute oblivion. He felt another ship go dark, another voice in his head silenced. He was down to 9. He was losing. His carefully constructed symphony was failing. Lyra's plan was a chaotic, suicidal, desperate roar of defiance. It was illogical. It was irrational. He realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, the most human thing he could possibly do. He had to choose die a quiet, strategic death, or risk everything on one final, cataclysmic crescendo. Part 5. The decision was a schism in his soul. 1,000 strategists screamed in protest, their combined logic a tidal wave of rational objection against Lyra's suicidal gambit. They presented probabilities of failure, models of catastrophic feedback loops, and 100 intricate reasons why attacking a star was an act of pure, unadulterated madness. But behind them, a billion other voices, the artists, the lovers, the poets, the rebels rose in a chaotic, unified chorus. They did not speak of strategy. They spoke of defiance. They roared with the illogical, beautiful fury of a species that had always chosen to spit in the eye of oblivion rather than bow before it. Kaelin silenced the strategists, embraced the madness, and, for the first time, gave an order that was entirely, terrifyingly human. "Do it," he commanded, his will a blade cleaving through the chaos. "Make them burn." The three remaining Cathar marauders, his final loyal ghosts, broke from the failing battle. They stopped firing at the erasers, ignoring the deconstruction fields that licked at their heels, and turned their raptor-like prows toward the blazing heart of the system, the unstable blue giant, the Silenti. In their cold calculus, saw the maneuver as a retreat, a final, desperate act of a fractured consciousness. They did not pursue. They continued their slow, methodical advance on the asteroid, their prize almost within reach. It was a fatal miscalculation of their enemy's capacity for insane, glorious spite. Kaelin pushed the marauders to the very edge of their structural limits, their ancient shields groaning as they skimmed the outer layers of the star's corona. The heat was immense, a physical pressure he could feel even through his remote connection. On his command, the main cannons of the three ships, weapons designed to crack continents, began to draw power directly from the reactors in a final, suicidal surge. He felt the machines scream, a choir of dying technology, as they prepared to deliver their eulogy. "Now, Lyra," he whispered, "the order a final exhalation. Shield us." Lyra didn't answer. She acted. She slammed a heavy fist onto a console, rerouting all of the asteroid's stored power and the Namazan's own reactor output into a single vessel, the hulking Vorn battleship. She had spent days reinforcing its already formidable hull and rerouting its shield emitters. With a deep groan, the ghost ship moved, a lumbering beast positioning itself between their asteroid hideout and the blue sun, its triple reinforced prow becoming their only hope. Then Kalen gave the final command. 3 beams of incandescent energy, brighter than the star they were aimed at, lanced from the Marauders and struck the blue giant's photosphere in a single, precise point. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the star convulsed. The impact was a wound, and the star's response was a scream of pure elemental fury, a wave of plasma. A tsunami of light and radiation, hundreds of thousands of miles high, erupted from its surface. The coronal mass ejection was a physical manifestation of chaos, a wave of raw, untamed power that the Silentes ordered. Logical systems could not possibly comprehend. The 3 Cathar ships were the first to die, not deconstructed or unwound, but instantly vaporized. Their final act, a blaze of glory that was swallowed by the greater fire they had unleashed. The solar flare washed over the battlefield, a wave of creation's own wrath. The nearest Silenti eraser was consumed first. Its entropic shields, designed to deflect ordered energy and deconstruct matter, had no answer for the sheer, brute force pressure of a sun's rage. The shields flickered, overloaded, and failed. The liquid shadow hull boiled, its complex form dissolving not into its constituent elements, but into a primal scream of tortured physics before it was utterly annihilated. The other 2 erasers turned to flee, their fluid movements for the first time looking panicked, clumsy. It was too late. The wave of fire caught them, melting their logic, their purpose, and their very existence in its incandescent embrace. They died not with a whisper of erasure, but with the full-throated roar of a dying star. The shockwave slammed into the Vorn battleship. The ghost ship shuddered violently, its hull glowing cherry red, its shields flaring with an intensity that threatened to burn out Kalen's sensors. He could feel the strain, the groaning of tortured metal, the scream of an overloaded reactor, but it held. Lyra's foresight, her scavenger's instinct to reinforce the toughest thing she could find, had saved them. The storm passed, leaving in its wake a new reality. The cacophony was gone, its static silenced not by the Silenti, but by the star they had provoked. The nebula was now a roiling, expanding cloud of stellar plasma, a violent, newborn chaos. The ghost fleet was gone, sacrificed. The silence that returned was absolute, the silence of a slate wiped clean by fire. On the bridge of the Mnemosyne, Kalen collapsed into his chair, the psychic backlash leaving him trembling and hollowed out. The voices in his head were quiet, stunned into a collective hush. He had saved them, but he had done so by unleashing a weapon made from their own soul, and the act had left him scarred. Lyra stood beside him, her hand resting on the back of his chair, her knuckles white. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice quiet. He looked at the sensor display. It was blank. No erasers, no ghost fleet, just the angry knife pulsing heart of the blue giant and the expanding cloud of its fury. "Yes," he whispered, "it worked." They were alone again, a single living ship in a sector they had just sterilized. But they were alive. He looked at Lyra, the cynical scavenger who had taught him that sometimes the most logical move is to throw logic into the fire. She looked back, and in her tired gray eyes, he saw not a partner in survival, but a fellow human. "So what now, librarian?" she asked, the old cynicism gone. replaced by a raw, uncertain weariness. They'll be back. They'll send more. He knew she was right. They had won a battle, not the war, but something within him had shifted. He was no longer just the keeper of the flame. He was its bearer. The ghosts inside him were not a burden to be protected. They were a message to be shared. "We don't hide," he said, and the certainty in his own voice surprised him. He stood up, steady now, and walked to the communications console. "We do the one thing they can't understand. We start over." He began to compose a new broadcast. It wasn't a lure. It wasn't a symphony of defiance. It was a simple story. It was the story of the fall, the story of a ghost in a machine, the story of a scavenger in a graveyard, the story of how they fought back. He stripped it of artifice, of complex data, leaving only the raw, messy, emotional truth. At the end of it, he added a simple, repeating signal, a question asked in a dozen ancient, pre-fall Earth languages. "Is anyone out there?" He looked at Lyra. "It's a long shot." "So was shooting a star," she replied, a small, weary smile touching her lips for the first time. "I'm starting to like our odds." Kalen opened the channel, and the Minimazan, the last library of a dead species, broadcast its first story into the new. Violent silence. It was no longer just a ship of memory. It was a seed, cast into the void, waiting for a single impossible chance to find fertile ground and begin to grow again. The hunt was over. The journey had just begun.